Today, understand the three-way bars are valued and which applies to you right now. See the specific drivers that lift multiples, consistent EBITDA, transferable systems, strong lease terms, and owner independence. And leave today's episode with a 12 to 24 month roadmap to grow the valuation for your bar. Hello and welcome to the Bar Business Podcast, where we help bar owners increase profits, attract loyal guests, and simplify operations so you can avoid burnout and finally enjoy your life outside of your bar. I'm your host, Chris Schneider, the Bar Business Coach. So today on the Bar Business Podcast, we're going to talk about valuation methods, and get into what you can do to improve your valuation if you're setting up for a sale. Now, on the flip side of that, you're going to know exactly what to look for if you're looking at purchasing a bar as well from today's episode. If you go back about a year ago, we talked about valuation. We ran through the three primary methods. We're going to touch on those today. But today is really a lot more about how to increase the value of your bar than just how to value a bar. So we're going to start by talking through, okay, what is the reality of valuations? Then we're going to go through the three main methods people use. We're going to talk about what are the drivers. So what's going to put you towards the higher end of that valuation range that we're going to discuss? And then what's an actual strategy you can use to strategically increase the value of your bar over time? And even if you're not considering selling your bar in the next couple years, if there are things you can do to increase the value, I say do them. Why? Because A, you never know when somebody's going to walk in the door and want to buy your bar from you. It's not likely, but it happens. And B, you don't know if something's going to happen in your life that's going to put you in a place where you need to sell. So keeping valuation top of mind, even when you have no intention of selling, is never a bad idea. So starting off, let's talk about the reality of valuations. Now, here's the thing. We can talk about EBITDA. We can talk about multiples of sellers' discretionary earnings or cash flow. We'll get into both of those here in a second. But if we're talking EBITDA, most small hospitality businesses, bars, restaurants, cafes, all of them are going to run between 2 and 3 times EBITDA, 1.5 to 3, really. Sometimes you can get in that 4 or 5 times EBITDA range. And EBITDA, just to make sure we're all on the same page, earnings before interest, taxes, deductions and amortization, or depreciation and amortization. Essentially what we're talking about operating profit. So 2 to 3 times operating profit. It could be 4 to 5, but that has to be an exceptionally strong business to get in that 4 to 5 range. So really consider 2 to 3 is about where you are. So if your bar operating profit is $50,000, you're going to be looking at, 100 to 150. If it's $250,000, you're going to be looking at 500 to 750. That's a really good way to think about it. Now, things like build-out cost, inventory value, sweat equity, things that we all spend a lot of money on don't actually translate dollar for dollar into enterprise value, right? Most of the time when we value businesses, it's multiples of earnings, multiples of revenue, not anything to do with the build-out. That's one of the reasons if you're starting out in this business, you probably don't want to dump, $3-4 million on your build out, because that's really hard to recover unless you get sales to sustain it. Because even if you just try to sell everything in there, you're never going to recover the amount of money you spent. So that's part of the reason why being frugal when it comes to your build out and when it comes to updates and all of that can work in your favor. Now, obviously, if things are dingy, that does not work in your favor. That's going to hurt your business. So you need to figure out where that line is and kind of write it. That can be difficult. But just remember, if you have, an apple in one hand and an apple in the other hand, and one costs $2 and one costs $1, always use the $1 apple. It's still an apple, assuming that it's not like full of worms or holes or something. So make sure that you're not overspending, because that build out, that inventory, that sweat equity is not necessarily going to translate dollar to dollar when we're talking about evaluation. Another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about just kind of the reality of stuff here, almost 100% of the time when I talk to owners or when I talk to people buying a bar, what people think they're worth and what they are worth in the market tends to be a lot less. Because the bottom line is, regardless of any of the methods we're going to discuss, regardless of any of the math, regardless of anything at all, Your business is worth whatever somebody will write you a check and pay for it. And you could have a stellar business that on paper we look at and we go, oh, yeah, that should be worth, $500,000. And you list it for $500,000 and the best offer you get's 300,000. Guess what? It's really worth $300,000. It doesn't matter what the math says. Now you can have the opposite happen as well. It's less likely, it's less common, but it is very possible to have a bar that people really, really want to buy, and then they're willing to pay a premium for it, right? But the thing, again, at the end of the day, you always have to keep in mind, when it comes to the reality of what your bar is worth, it's worth whatever someone will write you a check for. No more, no less. But before we get that offer, before we have a check, we have to understand what are valuation methods that make sense. And there are essentially three of them. So there's a EBITDA multiple, there's a revenue multiple, and there's an asset-based way of doing it. Now, we'll start with asset-based. This is really the easiest. Now, asset-based is going to be generally bars that aren't making money, right? And when we say asset-based, it's what's the fair market value of the furnitures, fixtures, and equipment and the inventory, and that's what it's worth, right? It's just what's everything worth that's in the building. We're not giving any value to the business. That's why I said that's really only a valuation method we're going to use if a place is closed or is just not making money or is losing money, right? It's just worth what the stuff inside of it is worth. So let's put that to the side and talk about the two things that make sense when you are making money, and that's EBITDA multiples, so multiples of your operating profit and multiples of your revenue. Now, operating profit, EBITDA, that's what you're generally going to hear like venture capitalists and people talk about. And it's what a lot of people want to go to value bars. It's a perfectly okay method of doing it. And it's going to be between 1.5 and 3 times what that operating profit is. So I gave the examples earlier, but basically, you make $100,000 in operating profit, your bar's worth between 150 and 300, maybe 400 or 500 in exceptional cases. That's assuming $100,000 worth of EBITDA, or again, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Now, the thing about EBITDA is that's actually not what you're going to see when you go and look at a bar for sale. What you're going to see is SED, SDE, I should say, seller's discretionary earnings. And so how is seller's discretionary earnings different from EBITDA? Well, we're going to use them the same way. EBITDA is the right number to use if all the books are perfectly clean and there's no personal expenses in there and the owner's not paying themselves. And it's, if you were buying a C Corp version of a bar, which you never see, but if you're buying like a bar that was following public accounting for C corporations, then it would be a multiple of EBITDA. But a lot of times you're going to see this SDE, seller's discretionary earnings. And what that is that's the operating profit plus what the owner paid themselves, plus the gas money they put in their truck, plus their cell phone bill, right? It's basically all the money the owner's pulling out of it. And then we're taking that times 1.5 to 3. That's a great approach. The only problem with trying to figure off of EBITDA or seller's discretionary earnings is that we're relying on the seller to have good books. And I will tell you right now, as somebody that does the bookkeeping in this industry, as somebody that's been in a lot of restaurants' books, that's done a huge amount of bookkeeping and looking at books, I don't trust people that much. And it's not because I think they're doing something untoward or bad most of the time. It's just bookkeeping isn't easy. So when we're relying on seller's discretionary earnings or operating profit, we're relying on a number that they came up with. Because of that, I like to rely on revenue as the determining of value more often than not. And so with revenue, rather than taking a multiple that is greater than 1, we're going to take a multiple that's less than 1. So we're going to take the total revenue, which is a really easy number to determine. You can get it right off the tax return, right? And that's how I would do it. You can look at the POS too, but if the POS and the tax return disagree, go with the tax return number because that's what they actually claimed. But the bottom line here is you're going to take that big top line number. So let's just say for ease of example, it's $1 million. And it's going to generally be, our range here is going to be between 25 and 40%. So $1 million revenue bar is going to be between 250 and 400 grand. And if that $1 million revenue bar has a 10% margin, you can see that the EBITDA multiple would put you between 150 and 300. The revenue multiple puts you between 250 and 400, so it's probably worth 250 to 300, right? You can overlap them and look at it that way. But generally speaking, again, I always look at percentages of revenue versus a multiplier of EBITDA or seller's discretionary earnings, because the revenue is a more solid number. It's an easier number to find, and it's a more reliable number, generally speaking. Now, you'll notice on all these, I've given you ranges so far, right? EBITDA 1.5 to 3, revenue 25 to 40%. So, how do we determine where in that it goes? Well, we're going to look at a few things. First thing we're going to look at is how consistent is the profit, right? How consistent is the business? That's going to give us an idea of, is this a sustainable situation that we're basing our math off of? Second thing we're going to look at is, okay, how much is documented? Are there a lot of systems and processes here that are coming with, right? Is the team trained? Are there checklists? Are there a bunch of these things that, well, hell, I talk about saying that you need every week, right? Make checklists, make SOPs, blah, 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 blah. You guys have heard me say that ad nauseum. But do those exist? Because if they exist, then you don't have to make them. Then hey, you can pay a little bit more for it because you're going to save the time, right? And if you own a bar, make sure those exist so that you can have an easy handoff to a seller and demand a premium for your establishment. The third thing that's going to make a difference here is your lease terms, right? If you have 5 years left on your lease, that's more attractive than if you have 6 months left on your lease. If you have 6 months left on your lease, you're going to have trouble selling the place because no one's going to spend 200 grand and only have 6 months to make their money back. So the longer your lease, and this includes options, right? It doesn't have to be an active lease that shows for the next 20 years. But if you have a 5-year lease with 3 5-year options, that's going to show, okay, I can have this property for 20 years. That's going to give you a higher multiple. The other thing too here, what neighborhood are you in? Is the neighborhood going up or down? How nice is the place? Right? A dingy bar, generally speaking, demands a lower multiple than a nicer bar. So how nice it is, how nice the neighborhood is, what is the direction of that stuff? What, even on equipment, what's the life left on the equipment? All those little pieces are going to affect where we fall. And then the other big thing here that really goes to what your bar is worth is, what is your current level of owner independence? And when I say owner independence, what I mean is, what is your ability to not work in your bar? Because, it's I say it, every consultant says it, don't work in your bar, work on your bar. And that's just good advice for life in general. But when we're talking about valuation, the more you work on and not in, the easier your bar is to sell. Because if I go to buy a bar from somebody and they say, hey, I bartend here 5 days a week. Well, now I got to hire a bartender. I probably need to hire a manager because now if I don't want to be there 5 nights a week. So the more independent the business is from the ownership, the more money the business itself is worth, because it's a sustainable business and you as the owner are not key to that business continuing to function. So with all that said, right, with understanding the multiples, understanding the ways we do this, and understanding, at the end of the day, it's really just worth whatever somebody will write you a check for. What can we do to help improve the value of our bars? There's a few things, and we'll go through these one at a time, but I have 5 general areas for you to think about: financials, operations, lease, systems, and risk. And let's go through this. So financials. What do we need? Well, we need tight financials. We need to use a good chart of accounts. We need to have financials that actually tell a story and that are accurate, right? They have to make sense. And sure, sometimes in business, you're going to have outlier scenarios like, somebody slipped and fell and now you have a $10,000 legal bill. So you have $10,000 of legal expense in 1 month. That shit happens. But if there is something like that that's an outlier, you better note it and note why, so that you have that explanation when someone asks and you're talking financials. But more importantly, get them done properly, close them quickly, so that, especially if you're in the process of trying to sell an establishment, you can have constantly updated books that you can hand people that are legitimate, accurate, and up to date. On operations, make sure you have SOP binders, videos, all of that put together, and that it covers everything that you need, right? The opening, how do you open the bar? Service, what are your service standards? What are your touch points? What are you measuring about what your servers are doing? How do they handle cash? How do your managers handle cash? How do you make sure cash isn't going disappearing? What are your inventory systems? How do you handle them? How do you do your count? How accurate is your count? What's your actual versus theoretical? Is there any um, spoilage, any waste going on? Right? How much are you comping? How much are you voiding? Are your employees using comps and voids poorly? All of that is taken care of with SOPs. And the more SOP binders you have, the more videos you have, the more training material you have, the more valuable that is when you go to sell your bar. That takes us to the lease. As I said before, the longer the lease ability, the longer someone has the ability to hold a lease, the more they're willing to pay for a bar, generally speaking. So if you're thinking you're going to sell your bar in a year and you have 3 years left on your lease, maybe now's the time to start negotiating out some options for after the lease is up so that you have those documented. You have the landlord on the hook for them when you sell. At the same time on your lease, make sure that it can be assigned to someone else, because if you have a lease that isn't allowed to be assigned to a new tenant, you're stuck there and your landlord now can determine whether or not a sale happens. So if your lease isn't where you need it to be, go to the drawing board with your landlord, negotiate some extensions, get some options on there, and add that assignment clarity in so that you have something that you can sell. When it comes to your systems, make sure that you're reducing owner dependency. Make sure that your folks are cross-trained. Measure your costs every week. Know your KPIs. But most importantly, as I mentioned before, the more that the business relies on you, the harder it is to sell. So make sure you have systems in place and the business doesn't rely on you working in it, just on it. And then when it comes to risk, make sure you have some diversified revenue. Make sure you have diversified clientele, right? It's really hard to sell a consulting business with one client. Now, in bars, we don't ever have that scenario. But you see it all the time with consultants where they're like, oh, yeah, I'm a consultant. Who are your clients? Oh, I have this one giant client that I work for. Well, they decide they don't need you next week. You're out of business. So that's a big risk. Again, in bars, we don't have risks quite of that nature, but make sure you're diversified. Are you doing retail? Do you have catering? Are you selling packaged liquor where that's legal? So that you have more revenue options on the table than just a bar. It makes it more attractive again when you're going to sell. So what you need to do is come up with a way this takes a year or two to honestly. But if you get your financials, your operations, your lease, your systems all in the right spot and you mitigate your risk, you're going to end up with a bar that is significantly more valuable than it was before you started that process. And once you've done all these things and you're going to sell, put it all in a binder, package it together for the buyer. Give them a due diligence ready folder that has your financials, your SOPs, your vendor contracts and contracts, your KPIs, all the information that you would want so that when most people go look at a bar, they get a little fact sheet and maybe a P&L. And this way, when somebody's serious, you can just hand them a whole packet of information. Get an NDA first, but give them a whole packet of information. Then they actually understand what they're looking at buying and why it's worth what you're asking for it. So whether you're buying a bar or you own a bar, you have to know how to value it. And if you own a bar and your bar isn't set up in a place where it's sellable because I'm not going to sell it now, seriously consider working through some of these items so that you can get your bar ready to sell today, because you don't know what's going to happen in your life. And it's always better to be prepared than try to be rushing in from behind to solve an issue that could have been avoided in the first place. That about wraps it up for today. If you enjoyed today's insights, make sure you like, subscribe, and leave a review. If you are ready to take your bar to the next level, schedule a strategy session with me by clicking the link in the show notes below. Until next time, have a great day, and we will talk again later.